My name is Eliza, a military officer just back from the Middle East. When I pushed the door open, my shoulders were still heavy with dry sand and the sharp, chemical stench of jet fuel. All I wanted was a glass of ice water and my bed. But my family had already deployed in the living room. My father crossed his arms, jerking his chin toward the door. "Pack your things, leave the keys, you've got 2 days to get the hell out." In the corner of the kitchen, my sister swirled a glass of expensive wine, smirking at me like I was a pathetic beggar. My mother let out a hypocritical sigh. "This house is for your sister's wedding now. You're used to suffering in the army, Eliza. You'll figure it out." I stood there. They mistook my silence for the submission of someone backed into a corner. They had no idea that the safe upstairs held a secret I had waiting for them. Before I tell you what that secret is, let me know where you're listening to this story from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever been bled dry and tossed aside by your own flesh and blood. The weight of my tactical ruck, 60 pounds of gear and sweat, pulled at the raw skin of my collarbones. I let it go. The bag hit the oak floor with a heavy, dull thud that should have shaken the room. Nobody blinked. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and smelled like buttered turkey and expensive floor wax. This was the Smith household in suburban Boston. Pristine lawns outside, financial rot inside, and a family that treated loyalty like a bad investment. I scanned the room. My boots, caked in foreign dirt and grime, left dark streaks on the hardwood I'd paid to refinish 3 years ago. The contrast was a slap in the face. There sat my mother, Eleanor, perched on the edge of a white sheepskin sofa that cost more than a soldier's monthly hazard pay. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the dirt. My father, Arthur, stood like a sentry at the base of the stairs. His suit was sharp, but his eyes were desperate. The look of a man who had bet his soul on a business that was currently flatlining. "The locks get changed on Monday," Arthur said. His voice was flat, practiced. He didn't offer a welcome home. He didn't ask about the shrapnel scar itching under my left rib. He just delivered the sentence. "You've been gone. This house is too much for you to manage, especially with your unstable schedule." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her voice a soft, venomous purr. "Chloe is getting married, Eliza. She needs the space. She needs stability. You? You're a nomad. You're used to sleeping in dirt and shipping containers. You'll be fine." She smiled, the kind of smile people use when they're about to stab you and tell you it's for your own good. Across the room, Chloe leaned against the marble kitchen island. She was the golden child, the one who stayed home and spent the money I sent back while I was dodging IEDs. She swirled the ice in her glass, the clinking sound sharp and rhythmic. "Let's be real, Eliza," she said, her lip curling in a half sneer. "Your life isn't even normal. You don't belong in a neighborhood like this anymore. You belong in a barracks." I felt the heat rising, a slow, controlled burn in my chest. In the desert, panic gets you killed. Here, it would give them what they wanted. They wanted me to scream. They wanted a scene, a reason to call the cops and play the victims of their unhinged military daughter. I locked my jaw. My heart rate dropped into that calm, rhythmic space I used during combat patrols. I didn't say a word. I just looked at Arthur. I let my eyes drift from his receding hairline down to his polished shoes, then back up to his pupils. I stared until I saw him swallow hard. I saw the slight tremor in his hand. He knew I was reading him. He knew I could see the bankruptcy notices hidden in his desk and the lies piling up in his bank account. 2 days, Arthur repeated, his voice cracking just a fraction as he tried to reclaim the high ground. "We've already started moving your things to the garage." I looked at the boxes piled near the door. My shadow box of medals, the ones earned with blood and sleepless nights, was shoved under a stack of silk-wrapped wedding gifts for Chloe. A bronze star sat crooked against a box of designer linens. The disrespect was calculated. It was a tactical strike meant to let me know that my service meant nothing in this house. 2 days, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since walking through the door. My voice sounded like gravel, dry and low. "Is that all you have to say?" Chloe snapped, her ice glass hitting the marble with a sharp crack. She looked disappointed. She wanted a fight. She wanted to see me broken. I gave a single, rigid nod. Done. The word fell like a lead weight. Eleanor's fake smile faltered. Arthur shifted his weight, suddenly looking like he'd stepped into a kill zone he hadn't scouted. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I turned my back on them, my combat boots thudding toward the stairs. They thought I was retreating. They thought they'd won the ground. They had no idea I was just clearing the blast radius. As I reached the landing, my boot came down on a loose floorboard. The wood groaned, a sharp, dry creak that echoed through the silent hallway. I stopped. The sound was a trigger. It pulled me back 5 years, to a cold winter night when I was home on leave, working by a dim flashlight to fix this exact board so my grandfather wouldn't trip on his way to the bathroom. I remembered the smell of the wood glue and the way the old man's hand had felt, paper thin and shaking, as he thanked me for being the only one who gave a damn. I looked down at the wood. Underneath that board was a hollow space, and inside that space was the reason I wasn't worried about Arthur's 2-day deadline. They thought they were evicting me from their house. They were about to find out that they were just guests in mine. The floorboard under my boot doesn't just creak, it screams. It's a dry, hollow sound that echoes through the hallway, a sound that pulls me straight back to 5 years ago. Back to the desert heat, the sand in my teeth, and the phone call that changed everything. 5 years ago. I was in a command tent, staring at a topographic map, my skin itching under a sweat-stained uniform. The sat phone rang. It wasn't my parents. It was a nurse from the county hospital. Your grandfather's heart is failing, Eliza. You need to come home. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my ruck, looked my CO in the eye, and signed for emergency leave. While I was hitching rides on 3 different C-130 cargo planes, sitting on cold metal benches next to Humvees, my parents were elsewhere. I called them from a layover in Germany. No answer. I called again from a tarmac in Maine, straight to voicemail. Later, I found out why. Arthur and Eleanor were at the local golf club gala. They were hosting VIPs. They couldn't be bothered to pick up a phone for a dying man because it might ruin the mood of their fundraiser. I got home at midnight. The house was dark, smelling of stale air and neglect. My grandfather was in the spare room, his breathing ragged, his eyes clouded with pain. That was the night I stopped being just a soldier and became a combat medic in my own home. I turned the living room into a field hospital. I didn't ask for permission, I just did it. I set up the oxygen tanks, I bought the monitors, I color-coded the medication bottles with electrical tape because I didn't trust anyone else to get the dosage right. Red for morning, blue for night. I worked on a tactical rotation, 2 hours of sleep, then an hour of checking vitals. Rinse and repeat. My paycheck, my hazard pay, wasn't going into a savings account. It was going into this house. It paid for the private nurses when I had to be on duty. It paid for the medical-grade bed. It paid for the repairs on the furnace that Arthur forgot to fix. Every cent I earned for dodging mortars in a godforsaken desert was being poured into the foundation of a house that Arthur was already treating like an asset. Arthur and Eleanor would stop by once a month, maybe twice if they needed to keep up appearances for the neighbors. They'd stand in the doorway, at least 6 feet back, like they were afraid the old man's illness was contagious. Arthur would check his gold watch every 2 minutes. Eleanor would pull a scented handkerchief over her nose, complaining about the smell of rubbing alcohol and antiseptic. "It's so depressing in here, Eliza," she'd say, her eyes darting around the room. "Don't you think he'd be more comfortable in a facility? A professional one?" Translation: they wanted him out so they wouldn't have to look at the reality of aging. Or maybe they just wanted the room clear for more of Chloe's junk. Chloe was the worst of them. She came by exactly twice in 3 years. Both times she spent more time on her phone than looking at her own grandfather. I remember watching her stand on the front porch, adjusting her hair in the reflection of the window. She took a selfie with a pained expression, captioned it something about staying strong for family, and hit post. Then she'd turn to me and complain about the damp, chilly vibe of the house. She didn't see the stack of bills on the kitchen island. She didn't see the receipts for the oxygen refills. She was too busy showing off a new Hermes bag she'd bought with the allowance Arthur gave her, money he should have been using to help care for his own father. The breaking point came last winter. It was 3 a.m. A New England blizzard was howling outside, rattling the window panes. The heater had finally died, and the room was so cold I could see my own breath. I was sitting on a hard wooden chair, wrapped in my old army field jacket, my knees pulled to my chest. My fingernails were stained with the smell of sanitizer that never seemed to wash off. Grandpa opened his eyes. The fog of the morphine and the age seemed to lift for just a second. He looked at me, then he looked at the door. He looked like a man who had finally seen the truth through a dirty window. His hand, shaking and thin as parchment, reached out and gripped my wrist. He had a strength I didn't know he had left. "You're bleeding yourself dry for me, kid," he wheezed. His voice was like sandpaper on wood. "And they're just waiting." He pointed a finger toward the window. Outside, through the swirling snow, the headlights of a black BMW cut through the dark. Arthur was pulling into the driveway. He wasn't there to check on his father. He was there to check if the problem had finally resolved itself so he could move on with his life. "They're vultures, Eliza," Grandpa whispered, his grip tightening. "Every last one of them. If you've ever had a family member who only shows up when there's something to gain, you know exactly how Eliza feels right now. This kind of betrayal cuts deeper than any battlefield wound. Help me get this story to more people who need to hear it. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of Eliza's revenge. And do me a favor. Comment the word vulture down below if you've ever seen someone treat a family home like a payday instead of a place of love. Grandpa didn't let go of my wrist. His eyes were sharp now, two cold blue sparks in the dark room. "They think they've got it all figured out," he said, his breathing leveling out into something terrifyingly calm. "They think they're just waiting for a funeral. But they forgot one thing." He looked at the black BMW idling in the snow, Arthur's silhouette visible behind the glass, waiting for the lights in the house to go out. "Get your boots on, Eliza," Grandpa ordered. "You're taking me to see Daniel Mercer. Tomorrow morning. First thing." "Grandpa, it's a blizzard out there," I started. "I don't care if it's the end of the world," he snapped. "We're going to the lawyer, and we're going to make sure those vultures starve." The engine of my old Ford F-150 groaned in the pre-dawn bite of a Massachusetts winter. It was a rough, rattling sound, like a heavy smoker trying to clear their lungs after a long night. I didn't care. I needed that mechanical noise to drown out the suffocating silence of the house. I lifted Grandpa. He felt like a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in an old flannel shirt, and settled him into the passenger seat. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. We were moving under the cover of the morning fog, a tactical extraction executed right under the noses of the vultures sleeping upstairs. I drove through the back streets of the county, avoiding the main roads. The heater was barely pushing out a lukewarm breeze, and the smell of old upholstery and burnt motor oil filled the cab. I took the back entrance to the office of Daniel Mercer. Mercer wasn't some city lawyer with a glass skyscraper and an ego to match. He was an old-school shark who operated out of a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that had seen better days. He dealt with the messy stuff, the family feuds, the hidden debts, the kind of rot that standard firms wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The office smelled of mahogany, old paper, and stale cigar smoke. Mercer sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of dark, heavy timber. He didn't offer us coffee. He didn't smile. He just pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose and looked at Grandpa. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Arthur will sue her, Daniel," Grandpa said. His voice was thin but steady, cutting through the quiet of the room like a cold blade. "The moment I'm cold, he'll be at her throat for the deed. He'll bury her in legal fees until she's forced to sell just to put food in her mouth." Grandpa wasn't being dramatic. He knew his son better than anyone. He knew Arthur's greed was a bottomless pit that no amount of inheritance could ever fill. He knew Eleanor would provide the moral cover with her quiet sighs, and Chloe would provide the excuses with her shallow entitlement. Mercer didn't blink. He pulled a thick stack of parchment grade paper from a side drawer. The paper rustled, a dry, expensive sound. An irrevocable trust, Mercer said. His words were short, final. Once it's signed, the house doesn't belong to you anymore. It doesn't belong to the family. It belongs to the trust. It's a bunker, Eliza. A legal bunker. No one can sue to break it. No one can claim a piece of it for their debts. Grandpa looked at me. His eyes were clear, the fog of age burned away by a last spark of defiance. Eliza, you're the sole trustee. You decide who breathes the air in that house. You decide who walks across the grass. Not Arthur, not his wife, not that girl. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't some warm, fuzzy inheritance meant to make me feel loved. It was a commission, a command. He was handing me the keys to the fortress and telling me to hold the line at all costs. I looked at the documents. The fine print was a series of barricades, definitions of control, absolute limitations of access. It was a masterpiece of legal exclusion. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy in my hand, like the grip of my service pistol before a night patrol. Signing this meant declaring war on my own blood. It meant the end of family as I had ever known it. But then I remembered Eleanor's voice on the hospital voicemail, refusing to answer because she was at a fundraiser. I remembered Chloe's smug selfie on the porch. The ink was black and cold. My signature was a jagged line on the bottom of the last page. Mercer took a heavy metal seal from a velvet box on his desk. He positioned it over the signature with practiced precision. Clack thud. The sound of the notary stamp hitting the paper was sharp and industrial. It sounded exactly like the bolt of an M4 locking around into the chamber. Done. The oak-framed house was no longer a target for Arthur's creditors. It was a legal fortress, an unassailable stronghold built of ink and cold intent. Hide this, Mercer said, sliding the heavy folder toward me across the mahogany. And keep the USB. It's the recording of the old man's statement, in case they try to claim he wasn't of sound mind when he signed. I took the folder. The paper felt cold against my palm, a weight of responsibility I hadn't asked for but wouldn't abandon. We left the way we came, quiet, fast, through the shadows of the alley. Back at the house, I didn't put the papers in a drawer or under a mattress. I went to the second-floor office. I pulled the heavy steel safe out from the corner. It was an old-fashioned beast, gray and scarred by time. I tucked the copy of the trust and the black USB drive into the middle shelf. I spun the dial. Click, click, click. The sound of the tumblers falling into place was the most satisfying noise I'd heard in years. I was loaded, locked, ready for the engagement. Now, I'm standing in front of that same safe. The present day. The weight of my ruck is still dragging on my shoulders, the smell of jet fuel still clinging to my hair like a curse. I can hear the floorboards groaning downstairs, not the loose one I fixed. These are different footsteps, heavy, arrogant. Arthur is coming up the stairs. I can hear his breath, ragged and wet. He's not walking. He's marching with the confidence of a thief who thinks the coast is clear. He thinks he's coming to inspect his property. He thinks he's about to kick a homeless soldier out into the Massachusetts cold. I reach out. My hand, calloused and steady, grips the cold metal handle of the safe. My jaw is locked. My heart rate is steady. The footsteps stop right outside the door. The door handle rattles. Arthur doesn't knock. He never knocks. He pushes the door open, his face flushed with a mixture of fake authority and desperate greed. He sees me standing there. He sees the safe. The 2 days are up, Eliza, he snaps. His eyes are darting to the safe, his fingers twitching. I want the combination. Now! I'm not letting you walk out of here with anything that belongs to this family. I don't move. I don't flinch. I just keep my hand on the steel. I look at the man who shares my blood, but none of my soul. You want to see what's inside, Arthur? I say. My voice is a low, dangerous rumble. I give the dial one final turn. Clack. Friday. 1700 hours. The clock on the mantel ticked with a dry, mechanical rhythm. The 2-day deadline was up. I stood in the foyer of the Colonial, my back straight, my feet planted shoulder-width apart. I was a ghost in my own house. My entire existence was reduced to 3 cardboard boxes stacked by the door. The tape was jagged, the edges were rough. My tactical ruck leaned against the bottom step of the staircase, looking like a bruised, heavy animal. It was ugly. It was functional. It was a jagged scar against the polished oak floors. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was the heavy, breathless quiet that comes before a storm. Then, it happened. The screech of tires on the driveway, the sound of a heavy brake being pulled too hard. Arthur did not care about the lawn anymore. He had parked the BMW right on the grass, a final middle finger to the curb appeal he used to obsess over. The front door swung open. The family squad marched in. Arthur was in the lead, his chest puffed out like a peacock with a failing bank account. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He did not look at me. He looked at the ceiling, then at the walls, gauging the square footage of his prize. Behind him, Eleanor moved like a scavenger. Her eyes darted from the boxes to the mantel, checking if I had managed to smuggle out any of the good silver or the antique clocks. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask where I was going. She was just taking inventory of the carcass. Then came Chloe. The golden child. She walked in last, her heels clicking on the hardwood with a sharp, arrogant cadence. She was carrying a thick roll of blueprints, high-gloss paper, vibrant ink. She stopped in front of my ruck, her lip curling into a sneer that she had practiced in 1,000 mirrors. "Is this it?" she asked. Her voice was thin, dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from someone who has never earned $1 in her life. "Military gear is so cheap. It smells like a garage sale in here." I did not blink. I did not move. I watched her through the sniper lens of my own discipline. She was a target moving in a predictable pattern. She walked past me into the kitchen and unrolled her blueprints directly onto the marble island. That island was the spot where I used to crush ice for Grandpa. It was the spot where I had sat with him during the long, dark nights of his heart failure. She did not care. She flattened the paper over the cold stone, pointing a manicured finger at the drawings. "I am knocking this wall down," Chloe announced. Her voice echoed through the house, ownership already claimed. "The office is a tomb. It is dark and dusty. I'm going to rip out all that old wood and replace it with glass. We need light for the wedding photos." She was talking about erasing him. She was talking about tearing down the only room in this house that still held the scent of the man who had actually loved us. Arthur walked over, nodding his approval. He looked at the drawings like they were a map to his salvation. He did not see the history. He only saw the equity. "Done?" Arthur asked. He turned to me, jerking his chin toward the door. "It is 5 o'clock, Eliza. Time to move out. We have contractors coming in the morning." I reached down and slung the heavy strap of my ruck over my right shoulder. The weight felt familiar, safe. "Everything I own is in these boxes," I said. My voice was low, flat. I did not give them the satisfaction of a tremor. "I am leaving." I turned toward the door, playing the part of the defeated soldier. I made it 3 steps before the trap snapped shut. Not mine. His. Arthur stepped into my path, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He was an insecure man, and insecure men always overplay their hand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of keys, tossing them onto the marble island. The sound was a sharp, metallic clatter. "Not yet," Arthur snapped. He blocked the exit, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "I know how you operate, Eliza. You have been in this house alone for years. You think I am stupid? I'm not letting you walk out that door until I check the safe in the office. I want to see what you have tucked away in there before you disappear." I saw the greed flash in his pupils. He thought there was gold. He thought there was cash. He thought I was hiding the liquid assets he needed to stop his company from sinking into the dirt. I let a slow, calculated silence hang in the air. I looked at the floor, then back at him, making sure he saw the hesitation in my eyes. "It is just personal documents, Arthur," I said. I made my voice sound a little too defensive, a little too tight. "Open it," he barked. He felt the wind. He thought he had caught me in a lie. He gestured for Eleanor and Chloe to follow. Move, now. I turned and began the climb. The wooden stairs groaned under our collective weight. It was a forced march. I could hear Chloe's shallow breathing behind me, the sound of her heels still clicking, impatient for the kill. We reached the second floor and turned into the office. The room still smelled of Grandpa. Old paper, beeswax. The lingering medicinal scent of the life I had tried so hard to protect. The gray steel safe sat in the corner, a squat silent witness to the betrayal in the room. It looked cold, immovable. Arthur stood over it, his fingers twitching against his thighs. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of what he thought he was about to steal. "Open it," he ordered, his voice cracking with a frantic kind of authority. "Hurry up!" I dropped my rug to the floor. The sound was a heavy, final thud. I stepped toward the safe. The metal dial was cold against my fingertips. I felt the mechanical resistance of the tumblers as I began to turn the dial. Left, right, left. The clicking was the only sound in the room. My hand hovered over the handle. I looked back at the three of them. They were huddled together, eyes wide, waiting for the treasure that would save them from their own failures. They were standing in the middle of a minefield, and they were smiling. I gripped the handle. The cold steel bit into my palm. The dial stopped on the final number. There was a heavy mechanical click that vibrated through my fingertips as the internal bolt retracted. I gripped the handle and pulled. The heavy steel door let out a sharp, dry screech from the hinges. My family leaned in, three pairs of eyes wide with a hungry, desperate glint. They were looking for stacks of cold cash. They were looking for gold bullion or some secret offshore account that would save them from their own debts. There was nothing but shadows and dust. Lying on the center shelf was a single brown envelope and a yellow sticky note. Arthur lunged forward, his breath hot and smelling of cheap coffee. He snatched the note out of the safe, his hands shaking with a frantic energy. His eyes scanned the ink. I watched his face. I watched the way his skin turned a mottled, sickly gray as the words sank in. The note was short. It was the last thing the old man wanted them to see before the walls closed in. It read, "If you are reading this because you wanted to rob me, then you already know exactly why you are excluded." Arthur's jaw tightened until the bone looked like it would snap. He let out a low, guttural sound and ripped the brown envelope open. The sound of the paper tearing was like a gunshot in the small, cramped office. He pulled out the documents. I saw the thick parchment. I saw the official red notary seal that I had watched Daniel Mercer press into the paper months ago. It looked like a fresh wound against the white pages. "Irrevocable trust," Arthur whispered. His voice was paper thin. He turned the pages, his eyes darting across the legal headers. "Sole trustee, sole, Eliza?" Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The foundation on her face looked like cracked mud in the dim light of the office. "Sole trustee?" No, he could not do that. He was not himself. He was sick. He should have told us. I stood there. I crossed my arms, my back straight, my feet planted. "He did tell me," I said. My voice was a low, steady rumble that cut through their frantic breathing. "He told me exactly what he thought of you. He told me exactly what you were waiting for." Chloe let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She looked like a cornered animal. She spotted the small black USB drive that had been rolling around the bottom of the safe. She snatched it up, her manicured nails clicking against the metal. "This is it. This is where the money is. He hid it in a crypto account. He had to." She turned to the desk and slammed the drive into the side of the laptop. There was a sharp click as the port connected. She didn't wait. She double-clicked the only file on the screen. There was a static heavy hiss, a crackle of white noise, and then a voice filled the room. It was raspy, rough like gravel, but it carried the authority of a man who had commanded men in battle long before I was born. It was my grandfather. "I am of sound mind," the recording started, every word a tactical strike. "I am making this statement because I know my son. I know the vultures he has raised. I am protecting this house from the people who only see it as a payday to rob. I have chosen the only person who stood by me when the lights were fading. I have chosen Eliza." The recording cut out with a sharp, digital pop. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence you find in a bunker after the shells stop falling. Eleanor collapsed into the old wooden chair, her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. Arthur stood frozen, the irrevocable trust document crumpled in his fist. He looked at the paper like it was a death warrant. He realized the truth. He realized that the house was gone. The equity was gone. The bailout he had banked on was a ghost. Chloe turned on me, her face twisted, her eyes bloodshot with rage. You manipulated him. You used your military training to brainwash an old man. You are a fraud, Eliza. A thief. She stepped closer, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. We will take you to court. We will sue you for every cent. We will drag your name through the dirt until the army kicks you out. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. I moved past her, my movements slow and deliberate. I picked up my tactical ruck from the floor. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, the weight of it a familiar comfort. I walked to the door, then I stopped and turned back. I looked at Arthur. I looked at the man who had tried to throw his own daughter out into the cold to save a failing business. I saw the pupils of his eyes dilated with a raw, primal fear. He knew I had him. He knew the legal bunker was airtight. Try me, I said. 2 words. That was all it took. I walked out of the room and stepped into the hallway. I grabbed the heavy oak door to the office and pulled it shut. The sound of the latch catching was the final period on a sentence they never thought I would finish. I headed down the stairs, my boots thudding on the wood, leaving the wreckage behind. Mission accomplished. Phase 1 was complete. I was no longer the victim. I was the commander. 3 minutes after they fled the house, my phone started screaming. It was lying face up on the oak desk, vibrating against the wood with a jagged, persistent rhythm. Eleanor, I did not pick up. In the military, we call this radio silence. When the enemy is panicking, you do not give them a target. You let them drown in the quiet of their own making. The phone went dark. 5 seconds later, it lit up again. Same caller. I watched the screen until it timed out, then again and again. On the 6th attempt, I swiped the screen and hit the speakerphone icon. I did not say a word. I just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Eliza? Eliza, are you there? Eleanor's voice was thin, bordering on a total breakdown. I could hear the muffled sound of a car engine and Chloe's sharp, annoyed voice in the background. Please, honey, do not file those papers. Do not do this to your father. We can handle this internally. We are family. I am begging you. I stared at the wall. I did not blink. I did not offer her a single breath of confirmation. I simply pressed the red button and ended the call. The perimeter was sealed. Panic makes people sloppy. 10 minutes later, a text message pinged from Chloe. I saw the notification on the lock screen. If she does not buckle, tell Dad to push the dead angle. He's about to lose the company, and she will be terrified if she finds out the truth. The message vanished 4 seconds later. She had hit the unsend button. But she was playing against a professional. My thumb had already hit the buttons for a screenshot the moment the words appeared. I had the proof. I had the dead angle. I sat in the dark office, the only light coming from the cold blue glow of my laptop. I forwarded the image to Daniel Mercer through an encrypted channel. I began to run the numbers in my head. The 2-day deadline Arthur gave me was never about a wedding. You do not plan a suburban Massachusetts wedding in 48 hours. It was a tactical evacuation. Arthur needed me out so he could seize the property, lean on the equity, or sell it off in a fire sale before the banks realized he was underwater. He did not hate me. He just saw me as a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. I reached for my coffee mug. The liquid was stone cold and tasted like burnt dirt and bitterness. I drank it anyway. I needed the caffeine to keep the edge sharp. Around midnight, the notification chime on my laptop broke the silence. An email from Mercer. I opened the attachment. It was a financial autopsy of Arthur Smith. The numbers were a disaster. 3 major loans from Chase Bank were past their maturity dates. His corporate credit was frozen solid. the house was the only thing left with any real value, and he had been planning to strip it bare to keep his failing business afloat for another 6 months. Arthur was a shell of a man in a designer suit. He was a ghost driving a BMW he could not afford, and he had been willing to throw his daughter, a soldier who had just spent years dodging real fire, out into the street just to keep his lie going for one more season. The disgust settled in my gut like a lead weight. It was not just anger anymore. It was a cold, clinical realization of the rot I was dealing with. They were not just family members who had lost their way. They were predators who had mistaken my loyalty for a weakness they could exploit. If you have ever been the one person in your family who works the hardest, only to have the people you love try to use your success to bail out their own laziness, you know the weight Eliza's carrying right now. It is a betrayal that hits harder than any enemy fire. I need your help to make sure stories like this get told. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you Eliza's journey. And do me a favor, comment the word lies down below if you have ever seen someone hide their own failures behind a mask of family pride. I leaned back in the old wooden chair, the one Grandpa used to sit in when he read the morning paper. The blue light from the screen reflected off my pupils. Mercer had sent over the final piece of ammunition. It was a digital copy of a document from the bank. The header was bold. The font was aggressive. It was a foreclosure warning, stamped with a red digital seal that seemed to bleed onto the screen. Arthur was weeks away from losing everything, and he had thought he could use my home as his last shield. I closed the laptop. The silence in the house was absolute now, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a commander who had finished the briefing and was now waiting for the sun to rise. Tomorrow the battle would move from this office to the Middlesex County Courthouse. I was not going there to defend myself. I was going there to finish the job. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark New England street. The world outside looked peaceful, but inside this house, the war was just beginning to enter its final phase. Arthur had his dead angle, but I had the truth. And in a court of law, the truth is the only weapon that never jams. I checked my watch. 400 hours. Time to prep the uniform. Time to load the magazines. The courthouse opens at 9, and I plan to be the first one through the door. Arthur Smith has no idea what is coming for him. He thinks he's fighting a daughter. He's about to find out he's fighting a soldier who has already won. Thursday morning, Middlesex County Courthouse. The air inside the building was cold, smelling of heavy industrial wood polish and the stale, dry breath of 1,000 desperate legal battles. The ceiling was high, vaulted like a cathedral built for judgment rather than mercy. Every sound echoed, the sharp, rhythmic click of my black heels on the marble floor, the muffled coughs of the few people sitting in the gallery, the distant hum of an HVAC system that felt like it hadn't been cleaned since the 50s. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back a rigid line of military discipline. I wasn't wearing my uniform today. I had traded the camouflage for a black suit, tailored so sharp it felt like a second skin. It was my new armor. Across the narrow aisle, the Smiths sat in a row. They were a study in suburban New England entitlement. Arthur was in a charcoal designer suit that probably cost more than my first truck. Eleanor was draped in a soft, cream-colored cardigan, clutching a small leather handbag like it was a holy relic. Chloe sat at the end, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her jaw tight with a petulant, bored fury. They looked like high society rats trapped in a very expensive cage. Their lawyer, a guy named Henderson with slicked back hair and a smile that looked like it had been filed down for maximum damage, fired the first shot. He didn't use facts. He used character assassination. He threw a series of photos onto the projector. Images of me from my time in the Middle East, grimy, bandaged, holding a rifle. Captain Smith is a hero, certainly, Henderson said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily reverence. But we are not here to talk about her service. We are here to talk about her stability. The war changes people. It breaks them. We believe the irrevocable trust signed by the late Mr. Smith wasn't an act of love. It was the result of a military-grade psychological manipulation by a daughter whose mind has been warped by the trauma of combat. I didn't flinch. I didn't let a single muscle in my face move. I watched him through the cold clinical lens of a sniper. He was a target moving in a predictable pattern, thinking he could use my sacrifice as a weapon against me. Eleanor started her act right on cue. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic pack of tissues. The sound of the plastic crinkling was loud in the silence of the courtroom. A cheap, jagged noise that cut through the tension. She didn't cry. She performed. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with practiced precision, letting out a series of calculated, shallow sobs. "We just wanted her to be safe," Eleanor whispered, her voice amplified by the microphone. But she came back so cold. She treated her grandfather like a mission, not a person. She isolated him. She used his fear to sign away our family home. We are the ones who were there for the holidays. She was just gone. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. The woman who wouldn't pick up a satellite phone from a war zone was now weeping about the holidays. Daniel Mercer stood up. He didn't rush. He buttoned his vest with a slow, deliberate movement that commanded the room. Mercer wasn't a performer. He was a strategist. He didn't use adjectives. He used an evidence bomb. He didn't argue with Eleanor. He just started sliding documents onto the judge's desk. "Let's talk about being there, Mrs. Smith," Mercer said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. A stack of medical bills appeared on the screen. Each one was stamped with a red paid notification. For 5 years, while Eliza Smith was receiving hazard pay for dodging IEDs in the desert, every single cent, exactly $250 a month in supplemental combat pay, was being wired directly to her grandfather's hospice care. While you were at the golf club gala, Eliza was buying her grandfather's oxygen tanks from a command post 3,000 miles away. The crinkling of the tissue pack stopped. Eleanor froze. The judge, an old man with eyes like flint, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses, peering at the bank statements. Mercer didn't stop. He threw up the sworn statement from the head nurse of the hospice facility. In 3 years, Arthur and Eleanor Smith visited exactly 6 times. Eliza Smith called every night at 1900 hours, regardless of the weather or the combat situation. She paid for every repair on that house. She was the only one who knew his medication schedule. The loving family mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Henderson tried to object, his voice rising in a frantic attempt to steer the narrative back to family expectations. But the air had left the room for the Smiths. Arthur was sweating now, his collar looking too tight, his face mottled with a deep, sickly red. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Mercer picked up a red-tabbed folder from our table. He tapped it twice against the wood. A sharp, thud-thud that sounded like a round being chambered. He turned his back to the judge and looked directly at the row of Smith family members. He wasn't looking at Eleanor or Chloe. He was aiming for the head of the snake. "The defense claims Eliza Smith manipulated her father and grandfather," Mercer said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "But we have a different story to tell. A story about a company on the verge of bankruptcy and a daughter being used as a human shield for a failing ego." Arthur looked up, his eyes dilated with a raw, primal fear. He knew what was in that folder. He knew the dead angle Chloe had mentioned in her text was about to be turned against him. Mercer didn't wait. He looked at the court clerk, then back to the judge. "Your Honor," Mercer said, the folder hitting the table with a final, heavy sound. "I would like to call Arthur Smith to the witness stand. Under oath." Arthur turned white. He looked at the exit, but there was nowhere to run. The tactical field of fire was closed. Arthur Smith walked toward the witness stand like a man approaching his own gallows. He kept his chin high, adjusting the lapels of his charcoal suit. The uniform of a man who still believed his own lies. But I saw it. The way his heels dragged. The slight tremor in his right hand. He sat in the heavy wooden chair, and the sound of it scraping across the floor was a jagged screech that set my teeth on edge. He was a shell. A hollowed-out CEO waiting for the final blow. The room smelled of old paper and the sharp chemical tang of floor wax, a cold scent that seemed to freeze the air in my lungs. Mercer stood by our table. He did not move fast. He just stared at Arthur for 5 long seconds, letting the silence rot. Then he stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking softly on the floor. "Mr. Smith," Mercer began, his voice calm, like a doctor discussing a terminal diagnosis. "You are a businessman, a man of numbers, a man of logic, correct?" Arthur cleared his throat. It was a wet, rattling sound. "I run a company, yes. And a company requires assets, liquidity, real estate." Mercer paced. "And when those assets dry up, a man gets desperate. Would you not agree?" Arthur's lawyer stood up to object, but the judge swiped him down with a look. Arthur gripped the edge of the wooden railing. His knuckles were white. "I do not see what my business has to do with my father's trust," he managed. His voice was higher than usual, tense. "It has everything to do with it," Mercer snapped. He did not raise his voice, but the weight of it increased. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his folder, the Chase Bank foreclosure notice. He walked up to the stand and held it 6 inches from Arthur's face. "You were 48 hours away from total collapse, were you not, Arthur? Your corporate credit was frozen solid. Your payroll was bouncing. You did not want a wedding for Chloe. You wanted a fire sale for that house." The room went dead. I looked at Eleanor. She had stopped her fake crying. Her face was frozen in shock, the skin around her eyes tight. She did not know. Beside her, Chloe's mouth hung open, her expensive sunglasses sliding down her nose. They were seeing the man they worshipped fall apart in real time. The air in the courtroom felt thin, like we were all standing on a mountain peak where the oxygen was running out. Arthur looked at the paper. Then he looked at the judge. Beads of sweat were rolling down his forehead, carving dark tracks through the expensive skin cream he used to hide his age. He shifted in his seat, the old wood groaning under the pressure of his lies. "I had a plan," Arthur whispered. "The plan was to use Eliza," Mercer countered. He was in Arthur's personal space now, his breath probably smelling of the same black coffee I had been drinking all night. "The daughter who was dodging mortars in Iraq while you were burning through your inheritance. You did not give her 48 hours to pack because of a wedding. You gave her 48 hours because that is when the bank was coming for your office. You needed her out so you could pledge that oak-framed house as collateral. You were going to use her home to save your failing ego." "She is my daughter," Arthur exploded. He slammed his fist onto the railing. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that echoed to the vaulted ceiling. He stood up, his face a dark, angry purple. The CEO mask was gone. The cornered rat was out. "She is my kid. She spent 5 years getting a paycheck from the government while I was keeping this family afloat. If the company goes down, we all go down. She has to sacrifice. It is her responsibility to save us." He was panting. The veins in his neck were bulging like blue cables under the skin. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, filled with a primal, selfish rage. He was not ashamed. He was indignant that I had dared to protect myself. He saw my life, my service, and my safety as nothing more than chips he could push across a gambling table. The judge did not say a word. He just watched Arthur huff and puff like a cornered animal. The silence in the court was no longer respectful. It was judgmental. It was the sound of a man being weighed and found wanting. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, feeling nothing but a cold, hard clarity. I was not a daughter to him. I was a bailout. "So," Mercer said, his voice a whisper that carried to every corner. The 48-hour deadline was a tactical strike, a theft disguised as a family crisis. Arthur did not answer. He could not. He slumped back into the chair, the air leaving his lungs in a long, pathetic hiss. He looked at Eleanor, but she had turned her head away, her eyes fixed on the floor. He looked at Chloe, but she was staring at her own manicured hands, realizing the money for her silk-wrapped wedding was a ghost. I did not turn away. I kept my eyes on him. I wanted to remember this. I wanted to remember the exact moment the man who tried to ruin me realized he was the one in the dirt. I saw a single drop of sweat fall from his chin and hit the polished wood of the witness stand. It was the only thing he had left to give. The judge reached for his heavy wooden gavel. His hand hovered over the block. He looked at Arthur, then at the documents, then at me. The weight of the world seemed to rest on the head of that hammer. Arthur looked up at the judge, his eyes pleading for one last lie to save him. The judge's jaw set. He did not look back. He raised the gavel high. The sound of the gavel was a clean, sharp crack. It echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling of the Middlesex County Courthouse, sounding less like wood on wood and more like a bone snapping in the dark. That was the sound of a world ending. Arthur's world. The judge was an old man with a face like a road map of bad decisions, and he looked like he had seen enough lies for 10 lifetimes. He did not smile. He did not offer any comfort. He just spoke in a flat, bored tone that carried the weight of a death sentence. The irrevocable trust was valid. Every dotted I, every crossed T. The lawsuit was dead on arrival. Arthur did not just lose the house, he lost the last bit of leverage he had against the banks. The judge did not stop at the ruling. He used the word predatory to describe Arthur's attempt to evict me. That is a word that sticks. It stains a man. Arthur looked down at his hands, his fingers interlaced so tight his knuckles were turning a ghostly white. He was a shell. He looked like a prisoner of war who had just been stripped of his stripes and told he was never going home. The CEO was gone. Only the debtor remained. Mercer pushed the final stack of paperwork across the polished mahogany table. It was the bill for my legal fees. Every hour Mercer had spent unfucking the mess they made was now a line item on Arthur's tab. Thousands of dollars. I watched Arthur reach into his charcoal suit jacket and pull out his checkbook. His hand was shaking so hard the pen rattled against the paper. The scratch of the nib was a dry, ugly sound in the silent room. It was the sound of his last safety net being shredded. He pushed the check toward Mercer without looking up. His pride was in the dirt, and he was finally starting to realize he could not buy his way out of this one. But Mercer was not done. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a separate filing, a no trespassing order, a legal perimeter. The judge signed it without a second thought. It was a 50-meter dead zone. If Arthur, Eleanor, or Chloe so much as breathed on the grass of my property, the police would be there with handcuffs. The boundary was drawn in black ink on white paper, as sharp and cold as a run of concertina wire. The family business was officially closed. The session was adjourned. The room began to clear, the muffled sounds of footsteps and heavy doors closing filling the space. Eleanor stood up, her soft cream cardigan looking like a rag against her pale skin. She did not look at Arthur. She did not look at Chloe. She looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw the mask slip. There was no performance left. No fake tears for a jury that was not there. Just a hollow, desperate fear. I grabbed my briefcase and stood up, my movement slow and deliberate. I did not look for a reaction. I headed for the exit. I was halfway down the long, cold hallway when I heard the frantic click of heels behind me. Eliza! Eliza, wait! I stopped. I did not turn around. I just stood there, my back to her, listening to the echoes of her breathing. Eleanor caught up to me, her chest heaving. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to grab the sleeve of my black suit. I stepped back. I did not let her touch me. That hand did not feel like a mother's touch. It felt like a threat. It felt like a trap I had finally managed to spring. Eliza, please, she whispered. Her voice was cracked, the high society polish completely gone. We are family. You cannot just cut us out like this. We have nowhere else to go. Your father, he is ruined. We are going to lose everything. Please, let us come home. We can talk about this. I looked her in the eye. I saw the selfishness behind the plea. She did not want me. She wanted the roof over her head. She wanted the status that came with the oak-framed house. She wanted the life I had paid for with my blood. No, I said. The word was a single, heavy stone. You are the plaintiff. I am the defendant. From this moment on, you do not exist to me. Any further communication goes through Mercer. I turned my back on her and walked away. I did not look back when I heard her let out a sharp, jagged sob. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the New England winter. The air was a cold, brutal shock against my face, smelling of salt and frozen earth. It was beautiful. I walked across the parking lot, my boots crunching on the thin layer of ice. Near the far end of the lot, I saw them. Arthur and Chloe were standing by the BMW, the car that probably belonged to the bank now. They were screaming at each other, their voices lost in the howling wind. Chloe was gesturing wildly, her expensive sunglasses missing, her face twisted in a mask of ugly entitlement. Arthur was hunched over, his hands over his ears, a broken man in an expensive suit. They were ghosts, shadows of a life I no longer had to lead. I walked past them. I did not slow down. I did not acknowledge their existence. I reached my truck, climbed into the cab, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a powerful, rhythmic growl. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot, heading toward the highway. The house was waiting. For the first time in 5 years, the silence would be mine. The perimeter was sealed. I drove into the gray New England afternoon, the heater finally kicking in as the courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror. I was going home, and I was going there alone. I pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later. I sat in the cab for a moment, watching the house. It looked different now. It did not look like a burden or a battleground. It looked like a fortress. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door, the cold wind whipping at my coat. I reached into my pocket and felt the heavy weight of the brass key. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, solid click. I opened the door and stepped into the foyer. The house was dead quiet. No voices, no footsteps, no demands. I stood there in the dark, listening to the house breathe. I reached out and touched the oak trim of the door frame. Then, the phone in my pocket vibrated. A new message. Unknown number. I pulled it out. The screen glowed in the dim hallway. One sentence. You think you won, but you forgot about the basement. The sun was a dying ember over the tree line. 1,700 hours. The Massachusetts air had a bite to it, a dry cold that made my lungs feel tight and clean. I stood on the front porch, the same porch where Arthur had tried to play his last card. My hands were grease-stained, my knuckles raw from the work. I looked down at the old brass lock lying in the dirt. It was pitted, corroded. A relic of a time when I thought a door was just something you opened for people you loved. I kicked it off the edge. It hit the frozen ground with a dull thud. Junk. I picked up the new unit, brushed steel digital deadbolt, heavy as a brick. I did not hire a locksmith. I did not want a stranger knowing my layout. I held the screwdriver, feeling the resistance as I drove long steel screws into the oak frame. The metal groaned. The wood resisted. I pushed harder, my shoulder muscles bunching. The screw seated perfectly. I repeated the process until the strike plate was fused to the house. I punched in the code. The motor whirred and the bolt slid into place. It made a metallic clack. Firewall complete. No more brass keys. No more uninvited guests. I stepped inside and closed the door. The foyer was shadowed, the air still smelling of courthouse wax. I walked to the living room. The heavy curtains were still drawn, keeping the room in a state of artificial mourning. I ripped them open. Late day light flooded the floor, highlighting the dust. I did not wait for the memories to start. I moved. I grabbed a heavy-duty trash bag and started in the corner. I reached for the framed photo on the mantel. Arthur, Eleanor, and Chloe, smiling. Painted on smiles. Arthur wore that smug grin he used when he was about to screw someone over. I did not take the photo out of the frame. I did not look at it long enough to feel the old sting. I just dropped the whole thing into the bag. Glass shattered. The sound was satisfying. Next were the gifts. A silk scarf Eleanor gave me for a birthday she forgot. A silver-plated clock that never kept time. A set of useless coasters Chloe bought. It was all dead weight. It was just clutter. I swept the mantel clean with one motion, into the bag. I moved through the house like a demolition crew. Every item that carried the scent of their hypocrisy went into the black plastic. The bag was heavy. I dragged it across the hardwood, the plastic screeching. I hauled it out to the industrial bin. I did not feel loss. I felt like I had finally taken out rotting groceries that had been sitting in the sun too long. The air in the house felt lighter. I went back to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under my feet. I turned the burner on and watched the blue flame. I filled the kettle and waited. The silence was absolute. No screaming, no passive-aggressive sighs, no footsteps from someone looking to steal my peace. Just the low hum of the refrigerator. The kettle hissed. I poured the water over dark, bitter grounds. I reached for Grandpa's mug. Heavy white ceramic with a jagged chip on the rim. The only thing in this house that felt honest. It felt solid. I took the coffee and walked out to the back porch. The lake was a sheet of black glass. I sat in the old wooden Adirondack chair. The wood was gray and weathered, matching the New England winter. I felt the steam from the mug hit my face. It smelled of wood smoke. I took a sip. It was hot enough to scald. I looked out at the dark water. The battle was over. The family was a set of names on a restraining order. I had won the house, but that was not the real victory. The victory was the silence. I did not have to explain myself anymore. My shoulder was tight where the old wound sat. I adjusted my posture, sitting straighter. A soldier learns to live with the damage. You do not try to fix the scar, you just learn how to move around it. Arthur was a broken man in a rented apartment, and I was exactly where I belonged. I finished the coffee. I stood up and looked at the horizon. The sun was gone. I looked at the dark house behind me. It was empty, but it was not lonely. I pulled my phone from my pocket. No missed calls, no frantic texts, just dark glass. I held the power button down. I watched the screen fade to black. I did not need it. Mission complete, perimeter secured. The world outside could do what it wanted. My watch was over. I had stood my ground, and the ground had held. I took a deep breath of the cold air, feeling it burn in my throat. It was the taste of freedom. It was the only thing I'd ever really wanted. End of report, I whispered. I turned around, walked into the house, and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was the only answer I needed.